So here we are, we just exist. There is no God. Our existence precedes our essence. What does that mean? What are the implications of that? For Sartre, the existentialist atheist, the atheist existentialist, the consequences of the non-existence of God are huge. He says at the top of page 7 that the existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist. Embarrassing not personally, but for all of us, that we're embarrassed. If God does not exist, we've got some problems. And in a sense, this essay is just Sartre's idea of what the implications are and what the problems are if God doesn't exist. In speaking of abandonment, at the bottom of page 6, he says, and when we speak of abandonment, a favorite word of Heidegger, and again, this Heidegger character must have been someone that Sartre was reading very closely at the time, we only mean to say that God does not exist, and that it is necessary to draw the consequences of his absence right to the end. What's the first consequence of the non-existence of God? I would say that in his exposition, it comes on page 5. Now he kind of orders his thoughts with these three concepts of anguish, abandonment, and despair, a Kierkegaardian word. But the first implication is what he calls our complete and profound responsibility. That is, if we have no nature to guide us, if there is no God who has created values to guide us, still we must make choices. And now that we're completely alone, those choices are entirely our own. We are not prompted, guided, forced by any transcendent entity to do one thing or another. Our decisions are entirely spontaneous, so that whatever we do, they originate entirely from us, and we are entirely responsible for them. But he says that this brings with it what he calls anguish, because I think that makes sense, in the sense that if we are forced to decide, and if we can point to nothing beyond ourselves as a basis for our decision, then we agonize over those decisions, because what's the right thing to do in any one case is entirely unclear. Again, he says at the top of page 7, the existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. And I think he's really thinking of Plato there. And for Plato, the guide was the forms in that intelligible realm on the top of the divided line. And if we could discover them, then they were presumed to be an adequate guide for how to live a good life and for what we should do as human beings. But for Sartre, once we do away with God as a creator and sustainer and legitimator of such values, we do away with the values themselves. That is, those values disappear as anything that has any kind of authority. He continues, there can no longer be any good a priori. A priori meaning at the beginning of things, or prior to experience. That is, there are no a priori values that are simply discovered by the human being. There is nothing there to be discovered. All values have to be created by the human being. There can no longer be any good a priori, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. You do away with God, you do away with the idea of any kind of universal values. It is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. That's the humanism part of the title. That is, if you're an existentialist of Sartre's kind, you're an atheist. And once you do away with God, all that's left are human beings. And everything we do and we say, and all of our values and all of our claims to truth are within the realm of the human. There's nothing transcendent that we could refer to that would support anything that we say. We are definitely in a world of the world of the humanist. Dostoevsky once wrote, I don't think he did, I think this is actually a misquote, but it's really good anyway. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that, for existentialism, is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man is in consequence forlorn, for he cannot find anything to depend on either within or outside himself. That is, again, there's no God as a guide, there's no transcendent reality as there was in Kierkegaard. There are no forms, ideal, universal truths to be discovered. We're alone, we're forlorn, and we have nothing to depend on outside of ourselves. Again, so a form of humanism. He discovers forthwith that he is without excuse. So if we don't have these values outside of ourselves to guide us, to show us the way, to give us some notion of how to live and be right or wrong, that we are without excuse. That is, every decision that we make, we have to take responsibility for, since it originates entirely within ourselves. And that notion of taking responsibility for ourselves is incredibly important in Sartre. For if indeed existence precedes essence, one will never be able to explain one's action by reference to a given and specific human nature. That is, we can never say, well, that's just the way I was made, or that's the structure of my being as a way of explaining any of our actions. If those things don't exist, if there is no human nature, there are no transcendent values, then we are without excuse in the sense that everything we do originates entirely in ourselves, and so we have to take responsibility for it. In other words, he says, there is no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. Wow. Does that sound like it's right out of Kierkegaard? Now, of course, Kierkegaard says the self is freedom. Here, Sartre is saying man is freedom. But it's a definite indication that he's relying a lot on the thought of Kierkegaard. But how different? How different? The fundamental truth and reality that had to be dealt with for Kierkegaard was that God did exist, and not only did he exist in some fashion, he exists right here, now, and demands to be acknowledged. For Sartre to say man is freedom in a context without God, sure, he's cribbing off of Kierkegaard. He'd be nothing without Kierkegaard. But at the same time, his atheism gives the statement an entirely different meaning, because if we are freedom, but there is nothing beyond ourselves that we encounter that is real, as there was in Kierkegaard, then that freedom is really at a loose end. What do we do with our freedom? He continues, nor, on the other hand, if God does not exist, are we provided with any values or commands that could legitimize our behavior, that could, make our behavior, give it a foundation, give a stamp of approval to our behavior. It's just hanging out there, our behavior. Thus, we have neither behind us nor before us in a luminous realm of values any means of justification or excuse. We are left alone, without excuse. That is what I say. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. There was a certain element of that in Kierkegaard too, no doubt. But here, the condemnation to be free is at the same time a realization of our freedom is a realization of ourselves. But it's also a kind of a curse, because we have absolutely no idea what we're supposed to do with this freedom. Condemned because he did not create himself. That is, we simply come into existence. Yet is nevertheless at liberty, and from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything that he does. So we're in a difficult position in the sense that we're free, so we're responsible for everything that we do. Yet we have no real guide. There is no guide in the universe. There is no inherent meaning or purpose in the universe that could help us make decisions. So on the one hand, we're entirely responsible. On the other, according to Sartre, we're entirely at a loss as to what to do, how to live, and on what basis we should make those decisions. So a lot of this essay and what follows is Sartre trying to explain this, defend this position against its critics, say it's not an irresponsible position, and that in fact it's the most optimistic, humanistic, and truthful, and in a way the most ethical position of all.